We'll now move on to oral questions put by members. The honourable member for the honourable leader of the official opposition.
My apologies. Mr. Speaker, for years, budget after budget from this government, we have been trying to make the government understand that we are in a mental health crisis. It's systemic, and it's an onslaught of tragic personal stories of struggle and loss, Mr. Speaker. This year's budget allocates $2.9 million to mental health services, and for what? And I quote from the release today, it's for community-based mental health supports to help those areas without quick access to outpatient clinics. This government's own website shows that wait times range between 45 days and a shameful 363 days. So I asked the Premier, can he please indicate which part of Nova Scotia currently does have quick access to outpatient clinics for mental health care?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable for the question. Mr. Speaker, I want to clarify some of her comments, Mr. Speaker. There's actually an increase in the overall budgets around mental health. I want to tell her the overall mental health in the Department of Health has gone from 281 million, Mr. Speaker, to 287 million. The youth centres that are across our province, which we've seen great results, have gone from 2 to 3 million, Mr. Speaker. We've seen the School Plus programs increase from 8.2 million to 9.8 million, where we're seeing very positive stuff. And Mr. Speaker, I would probably envision there's stuff coming in and around when we're dealing with the whole issues close to the inclusion report that we'll hear from, and of course announce the first project dealing with those issues at the universities, which is $500,000, which is a total of $8.6 million to bring our grand total, the issues on mental health, to over $300 million. The
Honourable Leader of the official opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Premier for that answer. It was a question that was directly asked by those from the Finance Department today, but in the past fiscal year, this government underspent its budget to pay clinicians by $4 million, and this just wasn't for doctors, right? And it's difficult to celebrate the 2.9 or whatever number that the government is throwing out when we don't have a plan. We don't have a plan. In fact, I believe that the number that they're investing in mental health might be even less than what they invested in the rink in Windsor. So my question, with communities losing psychiatrists, with people in a crisis being sent home from emergency rooms to wait the weekend, will the Premier please explain why the mental health of Nova Scotians is such a low priority in this budget?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank the honourable for question. I completely disagree with her premise on the whole issue, Mr. Speaker. As you tell, through a number of departments, we've worked continue to increase in excess of $8 million in addition to almost $300 million to address the issue. She's very right when she talked about hiring clinicians. It's been a challenge to hire psychiatrists. I'm very proud of the work we were doing with Doctors Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That was part of the announcement a few days ago, and I look forward to continuing to monitor and hear from the Minister of Health and the great work he's doing with psychiatrists across this province so that we continue to make sure we have health care providers proud as much question need. But let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, there's not one simple answer. That's why we've built a wraparound approach, and we'll continue to do so with all of our partners to deliver mental health services to the citizens.
The Honourable Leader of the official opposition on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems like this government is downloading its responsibility for mental health services to community support groups. We're seeing it in Pictou County. We don't have a psychiatrist. And I guess this way, perhaps they will have someone else to blame for this broken system. So I'm going to ask a straightforward, simple question. Is the Premier intending to put any more of the work of Department of Health and Wellness or Health Authority on the backs of community supports and 1-800 numbers without the system support they need?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of the work we've been able to do with our partners across the province, continue to improve services to the citizens of this great province, Mr. Speaker. We know there's more work to do. We believe that we do that by including all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, those who have specialties to help us deliver that service, and we're going to continue to work with those in community. The Conservatives may not think that partners in the community have any role to play. We believe partnering with them will continue to work with that. This investment makes it continue to increase. And as I said, the Minister of Health is working with our partners to ensure that we continue to hire more clinicians across this province to continue to provide those services in the communities where Nova Scotians need them.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government today has brought in a budget which does not provide for the opening of a single new nursing home bed anywhere in our province. This has come at a time when we know that there are hundreds of thousands of patient bed days in our province's hospitals where the bed is being occupied by people who are not hospital patients at all, but nursing home candidates who are waiting for a placement when there is no placement there for them. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier what possible account can he offer for himself as an explanation for this decision?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourman for the question. Mr. Speaker, as he would know, under the first mandate of our government, we continue to reduce that wait list by over 50%. We've heard from seniors in the province who want to make sure they can stay home and receive that service at home. It's why we've invested again in this particular budget in providing the home care services. The investment we're making to broaden the caregivers' allowance is providing for family members to care for people at home where their loved ones want to be, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work with our partners, and if it requires long-term care beds, Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to build that in the capital plan as we move forward. But we'll continue to work with the hospitals to ensure that the very issue the honourable member is talking about gets addressed. The list he refers to takes in a lot of Nova Scotia, not just those, quite frankly, who are looking for long-term care. The list he's referring to is palliative care, people who can't try to transition home immediately today. They're not looking for nursing home beds, Mr. Speaker. They're looking for loved ones to be able to look for them at home. Those are all of the numbers that he has built around this. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, clouds the debate on the reality of what we really need in the system, and it's not helpful to find the common solution that we all believe we deserve.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the preponderant majority of the people in the category of whom I'm speaking are people who living in a hospital in the province while they're waiting for nursing home placement are in possession of a professional care assessment which says that they are at a point in life when they cannot return to their homes. So to refer to this problem and to these people from the point of view, the perspective of home care is a quadruple red herring and a ridiculous irrelevancy. And so Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier, what does he say to the hundreds of people who are in our province waiting every day for the call to come from a nursing home so that they can make that transition that they're looking forward to, a call which is going to be that much delayed by the decision not to open any new nursing home beds in this budget?
The Honourable Premier.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Member for his question. The reality of it, Mr. Speaker, we've continued to reduce the wait list that grew under his government, Mr. Speaker. We've continued to reduce by 50%. The list that he's referring to, Mr. Speaker, has on people who are looking for palliative care. We're investing in hospitals across the province. We're continuing to make sure we have those palliative care positions. We also know in some cases people on that list who want to transition to home need those supports in and around them, Mr. Speaker. We're helping to transition them back to home, Mr. Speaker, with the investments we're making. And we'll continue to look at with our partners on whether or not we require more long-term care beds into the future. But the reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, we're responding to the needs that we hear from Nova Scotians and the way that Nova Scotians want us to respond to them.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not only has the government failed to open a single new nursing home bed in this budget, they've also actively failed to replace the funds that they have taken away from the operating finances of nursing homes in the provinces over the last 2 years, which amounts to around $4 million. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier, what possible justification can he have for not only failing to open any new nursing home beds, but for also failing to put back the money that he has taken away from the nursing home beds we've got?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. We had this debate last year, Mr. Speaker. What we did was, Mr. Speaker, is rationalize the administration part of delivering long-term care. We replaced funding back into those nursing homes across the province to continue to make sure that we provide those services. Maybe one of his own colleagues want to answer the question for him, Mr. Speaker. I think if they want to know...
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, they couldn't answer when they were in government, so now all of a sudden they get smart.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, the reality of it is we had this debate last year when it came to the administration costs of long-term care facilities. We reduced that. Some of that money's gone back into the food budget and occupational health and safety to respond to the needs of the patients, Mr. Speaker, for our loved ones who are in long-term care facilities. We're continuing to work with our partners to ensure that those Nova Scotians who require long-term care get it, and those Nova Scotians that want to live the remaining years of their life at home, to make sure that we have resources and programs in place to allow them to do so.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Premier. Ready or not, sometime this year, we are going to be selling recreational cannabis. And this budget anticipates gaining more than $20 million in new taxes from cannabis, but warns it will cost at least that much to sell it. It's a guesstimate with a flexibility in the model. Since this government has chosen to ignore the recommendations for keeping cannabis out of the hands of those under 25, or the strong recommendation not to sell it along with alcohol, it begs a very important question. Why is there no money or programming in this budget to educate or reduce harm to Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Premier.
Madam Speaker, there are budgets across that we have invested not only in the issues she's talking about, education, there's funding around policing, community safety. The reality of it is we had to identify through the best information we had to put a number item around the revenue. We built those budgets in our departments who are responsible. The Minister of Justice will be dealing with the issues around policing and the issues around safer communities. The Minister of Health will be dealing with some of those issues. And we'll also, as a broader government, be looking at how do we communicate to make sure that we build on the stuff that is happening at the national level. So we built into our assumptions, Mr. Speaker, that we'll be able to address the issues that will be part of this. But I want to be clear. We've said all along, all the costs borne associated with this will fall back on every provincial government across the country, and we're still negotiating with the national government to ensure they cover their share of these expenses.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to see that table, because a week ago or two we asked the question about how much money would be coming for this such a thing, and there was none at that point in time. So on this side of the House, we have been asking for a plan. We've been asking for something beyond a possible list of locations to sell cannabis, and this budget has nothing beyond a sales plan. The budget certainly doesn't factor in the human costs associated with the use of cannabis. So given the connection between cannabis and mental health crises such as anxiety and panic attacks and schizophrenia, how can this government even consider working out the sales and then dealing with the fallout later?
The Honourable Premier.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. She is right. That's why we have a budget, Mr. Speaker. We lay out the budget in this process. She'll get a chance to look at the entire budget as it goes forward. Not only the revenue that's coming in from the sale of marijuana, but the other stuff's associated with the other costs. We appreciate it. Fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, we had to put a line item when it came to revenue. What was the best assumptions we had that was presented to us? We looked at. That's the number we came up with, and we built into our departments as we continue to look forward about how do we build the costs associated with delivering this product to our citizens. We're working with our partners, whether it's municipal or federal police force, on the costs associated with ensuring they get the right devices in their system, training requirements that's going to be there. We're building into our assumptions in the Department of Justice. We're looking at the social costs that we come into our system. We're working with the Minister of Health to how do we address those across departmental issues, Mr. Speaker. And let me assure the honourable member, like everything else in this budget, Mr. Speaker, we've covered the assumptions associated with and will continue to deliver good, positive, forward-thinking government to the citizens. That's great province.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, by not opening a single new nursing home bed through this budget anywhere across the province, the government is having a severely negative impact on patient flow in the hospitals of the province. Across Nova Scotia, we have paramedics waiting 8, 10, 12, 14 hours to be able to offload patients because there is no room in the hospitals. We have patients who are being cared for on stretchers in hallways and corridors and in the alcove by the ice machine and Lord knows where because there's no room in the hospital. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier, does he not see the negative impact on the efficiency and the quality of care in our hospitals that is going to flow from this negative decision not to open a single nursing home bed with this budget?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In that long, drawn-out preamble coming into the question, the reality, one of the issues that he brought into that, Mr. Speaker, is the whole EHS that's being stopped in healthcare facilities is a real issue. It's one we need to address. The issue that he speaks about of long-term care patients, Mr. Speaker, he's equating that to the reason the ambulances are there. We don't necessarily agree with his vision of that or his rationale for that. What we do know, there is a challenge associated with EHS and ambulances being too long in hospitals. We're going to work with our partner to ensure that that transition, that handoff from highly qualified paramedics and the rigs that they operate in, that happens to our healthcare providers, so that we can transition back into ensuring that our highly qualified paramedics are out being able to respond to calls in the community.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, here's a short preamble. The decision to not open a single new nursing home bed in our province is a disappointment and a letdown and a sadness to the people of Nova Scotia. And therefore, I want to ask the Premier, what else are the people of our province to think but that he and his government at some level are failing to see or understand or grasp the depth of the healthcare crisis as we see it and experience it in the number of the people of our province who are living in hospitals because there's no place for them in a nursing home?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the question coming from the Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, I disagree with the entire premise as he's laying it out. Mr. Speaker, we continue to invest where Nova Scotians have told us they wanted us to do. Nova Scotians have told us they wanted to remain in their home as long as possible. We continue to make that. We've reduced the wait list for long-term care by over 50%. We're going to continue to work with families who are caring for loved ones, who loved one wants to be at home for as long as possible. We've done that by broadening the caregiver's allowance. We're continuing to work with them and our partners. And as I said to the Honourable Member in my first question, we'll continue to watch what's happening around long-term care facilities. But the issue that he's using to analyze and equate why we need more long-term care beds is just not accurate, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to differ that this government is not putting the money where the people of Nova Scotia want it. And psychiatry is a perfect example. Mr. Speaker, Pictou has no psychiatrist. Cape Breton has very few. People can't get access to care. And one of the reasons is the college changed the licensing laws. And I brought this up last fall to the Minister of Health. Can he please tell us today where in the budget is money to help define licensed physicians, provide academic support for them so they can pass their exams and stay in practice here in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The work within the Department of Health, as well as the partners with the Nova Scotia Health Authority, Mr. Speaker, work with our physicians through a variety of programs to support their needs and professional developments, Mr. Speaker, as well as funding within their own professional body with Doctors Nova Scotia. So there are a variety of opportunities, Mr. Speaker. The funding's available for programs that we have, and we invest heavily in a number of other programs expanding in this year's budget.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, there is actually no funding for defined licensed physicians in this province. So while our government is bragging that they're over in the UK recruiting new physicians, they're leaving faster than they can be recruited because these defined licensed doctors are coming here with no academic support. And they're expected to pass Royal College exams with no academic support while working full-time. Can the Minister of Health please tell us again, where in the budget is there money to help bring in psychiatrists, support them to practice here in Nova Scotia, and reduce the risks of suicide and people with mental health crisis in our province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Obviously, as we've discussed several times, the efforts to recruit and expand access to mental health clinicians, including psychiatrists, throughout the province, Mr. Speaker, is ongoing. The budget money is there to fund these positions, Mr. Speaker. I want to assure all Nova Scotians that is the case. The efforts that we've highlighted with respect to and in partnership with my colleague and the Department of Immigration, Mr. Speaker, recruiting is targeted preliminary in areas that don't require defined licenses, Mr. Speaker, but those individuals can come into Nova Scotia and practice with a full license, Mr. Speaker. That's why we've targeted those areas like the UK and the US that already receive full license recognition, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, we had two budgets tabled last year, one in the spring and one in the fall. And when the fall budget was tabled, we noted that the estimate for personal income tax revenue had reduced by $30 million between the spring and the fall budgets. And today we learned that even that reduced number was still too high. There was a further reduction of over $140 million. Mr. Speaker, this is a key indicator of personal income generation. And a slowdown in personal income generation that taxes are paying is not a good sign for the economy. So I'd like to ask the Minister, can the Minister explain why the province has seen what is amounted to a $175 million reduction in personal income tax revenues over the past year? Why has that happened, and what does that say about our economy?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member refers to the, I believe, the December forecast, the September budget and the December forecast. The same with our final forecast, which we tabled today. All of those numbers are based on assumptions, and when you look at the best information that you have at the time, you base your budget on that assumption. A budget is a plan. It is a long-range plan, and we recognize that there are times when the revenue is up and times when the expenses are up, so a balance between those two is what gives you a balanced budget.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Declining personal income tax revenue is an indicator of a declining economy, and that slowdown will eventually come. And we'll see that in higher unemployment, and we'll see it in greater out-migration. It's the economic canary in the coal mine. And yet today, in the budget table today, we see this government is quick to estimate an increase again in personal income tax revenue, despite the reality of what's happened over the past year. How can this government project continued economic growth in the face of the recent trend, which is downward revisions?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would remind the member and others to go back to the budget speech that was presented today, where we talked about 16,000 new jobs, full-time jobs in the province. Mr. Speaker, those new jobs, the consumer spending is up by 6% over last year. Those are all indicators that the economy is growing based on employment and spending.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has referred to increasing employment and increasing jobs in the province, and I don't see that from the budget. And I'd like to refer the Minister to the budget documents today, page 70 and 71, where the indication is that the labor force in 2013 was 497,000. It's for 2017 down to 490,000. That's a reduction. How can the Minister claim that jobs are increasing and things are great, when the reality is personal income tax revenue is decreasing and being revised downward, and the own numbers of this government refute the claim that there's more jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will go back to the 16,000 that I mentioned in the speech, and I will table the document which supports that. I said that since we took office, 2013, until now, there had been an increase of 16,000 in the workforce. In 2013, that number was 359,500. In February of 2018, it was 375,500. My math gives 16,000. I'll table that.
The
Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would ask the Minister to table that document so we can understand the discrepancy. And maybe it's a discrepancy between full-time and people working part-time being added into there. It's an important distinction because it's an indication of economic health. It's an indication of where our economy is going. So I would ask the Minister, despite all the numbers about who's working and who might not be, we'll sort that out. The reality is that the personal income tax revenue projections are going down. They were revised downward between the spring budget and the fall budget, and the adjustments today show that even that downward revision wasn't high enough. They keep going down. Is the Minister concerned that the numbers for personal income tax revenue in this budget aren't a true indication of what's happening in the economy?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, I did table that document. I'm sure you can get it and have a look at that. But as I said before, whenever you're building a budget, whenever you're making a plan, you have to look at revenue and expenses. You have to judge those based on assumptions, based on projections, and build a budget based on that. We did that. Yes, we're concerned when any revenue is going down, but we also have to make sure that we adjust our spending to accommodate that decrease.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. This budget acknowledges that Nova Scotians are facing mental health crisis, Mr. Speaker, that they need more support. Unfortunately, what we've seen here is a drop in the bucket compared to what is needed. I was proud to be a part of a government that established the province's first mental health and addiction strategy. Mr. Speaker, given the urgent need, why has this government failed to continue to update the work of this important strategy?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for both his question and his work around mental health, Mr. Speaker, during his time in office, and I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, as his question addresses a continued interest in this important area. But, Mr. Speaker, the work that's ongoing, Nova Scotians would know that there have been a number of initiatives that we've taken since forming government to receive feedback and recommendations from experts. There's a minister's panel that have made a number of recommendations. We had Dr. Stan Kuchar respond to an emerging situation last June, Mr. Speaker. Received recommendations from the Auditor General. All of this work supports our efforts to update the strategy to move forward, Mr. Speaker, continued investments as mental health priorities.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No mention in the budget speech today about the addiction, mental health and addiction strategy. They did mention a $2.9 million increase to the budget for mental health, which is about 1%. That's less than the rate of inflation and amounts to status quo in real terms, Mr. Speaker. The budget for addiction services last year was underspent by $2.5 million. The budget for the IWK mental health services underspent by $1 million. The Nova Scotia Health Authority mental health services underspent by $750 million, Mr. Speaker. So if the minister knows Nova Scotians need more mental health support, why don't we see that reflected in this year's budget?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I'd mentioned, we continue to recognize the needs of Nova Scotians. We've also acknowledged, Mr. Speaker, that the recruitment efforts are ongoing to secure the mental health clinicians that we need in our communities across Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. The full range of clinicians, Mr. Speaker, from psychiatrists to psychologists and social workers, nurse practitioners, physicians, Mr. Speaker, all of the healthcare professionals that provide supports to our Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to let the member know that we are having successes. Just recently, as part of our collaborative care practices, we recognized the role that social workers play. Had the opportunity to announce new social workers joining collaborative practices in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. This is growth, this is progress, and this is the work that we continue to be committed to move forward on.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Tourism. In this budget year, it looks like there's going to be less money for tourism compared to the previous year, including less money for marketing. In my constituency, we have, as I mentioned before, Fisherman's Cove, where we don't have any place to dock a boat if you want to come over from Halifax or Bedford or even Dartmouth. So I'm just wondering if the minister can explain to us what they're doing in terms of trying to help increase the tourism in our area, as well as whether there's efforts to help us get the wharf that we need to increase our tourism. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister responsible for tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, the budget is reflective of what not only the government but the private sector, the stakeholders are doing to reach that $4 billion goal of tourism revenue by 2024. Currently, we are at $2.7 billion at this point, which is significant. And there's a number of sectors, a number of different areas, large and small, that have a role to play. I don't know the specifics of the member's constituency and what that entails, but I'd be happy to have that conversation. But we look at the broad issues such as marketing, which is a big one. We let the experts and the third-party players do that for us, and they do a great job. We look at our investments in our infrastructure, which has been significant and historic, and of course the direct air access, which is going to make a big difference for the tourism complement here in Nova Scotia. We're doing great things, and the tourism sector are leading that charge. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that answer. My question now is to the Minister of Community Services. Last 3 years, there was a $6 million budget for the sexual violence strategy. And in this year's budget document, it says that at-risk women will be getting a $2 million fund grant for community projects, research, and other initiatives focusing on preventing domestic violence and supporting victims. So I'm wondering if that $2 million is a continuation of that $6 million program, or if that program funding has been completely cut and now we have a different budget for sexual assault victims. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for that question. Of course, we want to support victims of violence, whether it's sexual violence or domestic violence. As we indicated previously, the sexual violence strategy was ending. There was $2 million in the budget for each of the years of the sexual violence strategy. There is $1 million continuing forward on sexual violence, and of course, sexual violence can also be domestic violence, so there is money for that as well. There is also money going to health for the continuation of trauma counselling.
Just before we move on to the next question, I want to remind the honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage that the supplementary question is intended to be a supplement to your first question, not a separate question from your first question. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. Nova Scotians are waiting for the province's report on school inclusion. And according to the latest information from the Department of Education, they are not due to release the final report until next week. Despite this, the department has earmarked $15 million to implement the recommendations from the Commission. The Commission website claims that submissions are still under deliberation. The budget figure, or the certainty of the budget figure, would indicate that the Minister already has a copy of the report. My question is this, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister tell us how long he's had the report, or did his department simply make up an amount for the inclusion recommendations? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do not have a copy of the report. That report has not been submitted to the department yet, nor to the union. Those are the two groups that the Commission is mandated to deliver that report to. I will say, though, in our budget deliberations, we did consult with the Commission on a realm of what the financial ask would be, because we did want to ensure that it was embedded in the budget so that we could move on that report as swiftly as possible.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, $15 million works out to about $40,000 per school in our province, and that might not be enough to pay for what's required to tackle the issues within our classroom. Now, without the report, Mr. Speaker, there's no way to know what is intended to cover and whether it will be enough. Without that report, this House cannot properly examine the budget for this initiative. My question is this, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister indicate whether the $15 million will be ongoing funding, or is it a one-time spend?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important to clarify for the member in the House that there is a difference between the fiscal year of the government and the academic year of our schools. So that $15 million would actually be representative of a half an academic year investment, Mr. Speaker. We believe that those dollars are significant. We know that we have to do a better job in terms of providing more behavioral supports, mental health supports, psychologist supports, speech pathologist supports, Mr. Speaker. And we are committed, as we have been in every single Liberal budget, to investing more and more dollars in our education system.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. As we heard in the budget today, Mr. Speaker, one of the priorities of this government is to enable young people to stay here in Nova Scotia, put down roots and lead fulfilling lives. Unfortunately, there's been an exodus of young people from our province, and that hurts us economically and culturally. All our young people want to do is have the opportunity we've all had and enjoyed, a chance to get an education, find a job, and settle into a productive role in our community. And all too often, our young people don't see a future here at home and leave for greener pastures. So my question to the Minister is, why is the Minister content to watch our best and brightest go down the road to build their lives?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to draw the member's attention to Stats Canada, which has recently said Nova Scotia for the last 2 years is retaining more youth than it's losing. Mr. Speaker, that's the first time it's happened since the 1980s. Mr. Speaker, what we are doing is we're keeping our youth here. We're giving them opportunities not only in government but in the private sector. Graduate opportunities, graduate innovation. Today's budget had $20 million more in a research fund, which goes to our youth, which goes to our brightest. Look at all the great work happening at both the labs, the sandboxes, Cove. Mr. Speaker, I could go on and on, but 1 minute is not enough. But Mr. Speaker, what there is happening in this province is a lot of excitement. Our youth have opportunities here, and they're embracing the opportunities and going to work.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, recently I had a young man in my office who applied for a job creation program to help him stay at home and contribute in his community till he can find work in his field. He was denied that grant, told that he didn't have enough of a job search in his pocket, and told by the ENS staff to look outside this province for work in his field. Yet this government is telling him to do just that, leave here to look for a job outside his field. So why is the minister driving our trained young people to other provinces instead of them helping them stay here to build a better future?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, we're doing nothing of this such. I'm going to draw the member's attention to a policy change that was done at the Public Service Commission while I was the minister there. When I became the minister of that department, every single job posting in the province of Nova Scotia said you need 2 years of experience. That meant anyone graduating from university or our colleges had to go somewhere to get 2 years of experience. So what the government's message was go to another province, get experience, then we'll take you back when you have that experience. This government changed that policy, Mr. Speaker. I'll repeat that again because I heard the member yelling and I think he should hear this. This government changed that policy. And Mr. Speaker, after it changed that policy, 1,000...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, once that policy change was made, 1,800 youth got jobs in the Public Service Commission who would never have had that opportunity before.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. In Cape Breton, not a month goes by without a weekend where the emergency rooms in Waterford, Glace Bay and the Northside General are all closed. So my question to the Minister is this. Mr. Speaker, what is the Minister's excuse for failing to take any action to keep emergency rooms open on Cape Breton Island?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. As the member knows, investing in our healthcare system is a priority for this government, a significant part of the budget that was tabled by my colleague, the Minister of Finance, earlier today, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing significant investments and expanded investments in our healthcare budget, Mr. Speaker, providing investments to support our partners throughout initiatives in mental health and primary care access, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue with these investments on behalf of Nova Scotians from one end of the province in Cape Breton, but also all the way down to Yarmouth as well.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, during the difficult times when families find themselves in an emergency, they should be able to count on their local emergency rooms to be open. But under this Liberal government, not a new single collaborative care emergency centre has opened, and actually the mobile care team in Waterford has closed. So, Mr. Speaker, is the minister satisfied standing by while families across Nova Scotia show up to emergency rooms that are closed?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We continue to work with our partners, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that emergency rooms and emergency services across this province are available to Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, it's an integrated system of healthcare services. It's one of the reasons why we have a single health authority, the Nova Scotia Health Authority, to ensure that services are provided at multiple sites throughout the province, ensuring that the standards, Mr. Speaker, of care being provided. We have an amazing first-class emergency health service ambulance system, Mr. Speaker. The paramedics, Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia are top-notch. They have excellent equipment, Mr. Speaker, to provide care to all Nova Scotians from one end of the province to the other.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I did try to attempt to get this question in prior to the break, but time ran short, so we're going to try again today. Through you to the Minister of Education. Parents have continued to express concerns to me about maximum distance that the province and school boards are setting for walking and busting. Distances set provincially at 3.6 kilometres are before students can be bused, whether they're 5 or 18 years old. Halifax Regional School Board has a policy of 2.4 kilometres, which many parents in HRM already feel is too far. The minister did say that a standardized policy across the province is one of the objectives of centralization, and in September, the minister stated there are many out there who would argue that having our children walk to school is a healthy exercise. My question is, will the minister commit to coming out to my constituency and joining myself and a 5-year-old to walk the 7.2 to school and back?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I took up the member from Pictou Centre's offer on a walk on the beach. I'd be happy to take the member's offer on a walk along these streets in his riding.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the minister is in probably a little bit younger and better shape than me, so it won't be as hard for him, I'm sure. Halifax Regional School Board, Mr. Speaker, uses its discretion based on more than just distance. However, at the end of this month, of course, Halifax Regional School Board's not going to be there anymore. Parents are left with anxiety and they're worrying about the safety of their children who are walking to school at distances that they may have to now walk. Will the minister commit today that the busing distance for students in grades primary to 6 within the HRM will continue at the 2.4 kilometres and not increase?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to work with our regional education centres to ensure that our kids are safe getting to and from school and that we have the best practices that are applied in every single region of this province. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On October 17th, I asked the Minister of Education about a constituent whose daughters were walking 47 minutes to school, crossing one of the busiest streets in our province. The minister stated, if indeed there are safety concerns that are being expressed by parents, they do need to be properly addressed by the school board, and I can table that, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, it may surprise the minister to hear there are safety concerns being expressed by parents. This mother has logged dozens of phone calls searching for the solution since May. She's been to every possible level of the education system, and her daughters are still walking 47 minutes to school daily, crossing one of the busiest streets in Nova Scotia. My question is this. With power about to be taken away from elected school boards, will the minister take charge of Colleen Holohan's issue and find a solution to safely get her daughters to school?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Transportation has been an issue of concern primarily in the HRM area, and that is something that we're going to be taking a look at because safety is paramount to getting our kids to and from our schools in a way that we know we can all be comfortable with. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, on January 31st, my office sent a letter to the Superintendent of the HRSB as well as to the Minister's office. This letter proposed, Mr. Speaker, a very reasonable solution to get Colleen Holohan's daughters on a school bus. This letter has gone unanswered, and Colleen's daughters continue to walk to school. My question is this, Mr. Speaker. Why has the minister failed to respond to my office's simple request to help my constituent get her daughters to and from school safely?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That's because we want to look at potential solutions with the regional executive director to make sure that all options are being considered before we provide a response to the member on behalf of his constituent.
The Honourable House Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education, Early Childhood Development as well. I've asked about Ecole Wedgeport a number of times in this House, but I haven't asked the Minister so I can get him on answered. Ecole Wedgeport is a school of about 100 students in a small Francophone community in my constituency and a very close neighbour to the minister's own constituency as well. And we've been seeking some significant renovation or complete replacement for that school. The current facility is facing some serious physical challenges that makes it a difficult learning environment. My question, is the minister able to tell this House if the capital plan in today's budget includes the much needed work for Ecole Wedgeport?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister of Finance stated earlier today, the capital plan is not being released with this budget, although the dollars are invested in this budget to make sure that we're able to conduct that capital program. However, we are looking at the Auditor General's recommendations along with Dr. Glaze's recommendations to improve that process so that it's longer term and that we have a process for capital planning that is predictable and that the public can have full faith and confidence in. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much. Ecole Wedgeport has been on the top of the CCAP's capital plan for the last 12 years. And I've tabled petitions in this House as well. And with recent changes to the Education Act, I believe that Ecole Wedgeport now sits at the top of half of the capital plans or half of the school boards in this province. Mr. Speaker, the last time any investment was done on this school was when the Minister of Finance was the Minister of Education in the previous government. I just want to say. And I, of course, thanked her at that time for her investment, but it was to hold over money until the school could get a replacement. So my question is, how long will this project sit at the top of the list before your department will allocate its capital funding?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've actually toured Ecole Wedgeport myself with members of the community and the SAC and the school board and the CSAP. And I agree with the member that we do need a new school for that community. It's important to preserve the culture and language of Wedgeport and the surrounding area. And I want to see a new school in that community, Mr. Speaker. I will say that we will not have a finalized capital list until June, as the Minister of Finance said today. But I think once we solidify a better process for capital planning, a long-term process for that planning, I think members of the public will be very satisfied with that list at the end of the day.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, today the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board told us that the budget building involves establishing a set of economic assumptions that become the foundation upon which the budget is built. A central part of that foundation, Mr. Speaker, central part of that foundation, Mr. Speaker, is the wage pattern that has not been agreed to by many of the groups the government is still trying to negotiate with. Mr. Speaker, is the Minister of Finance satisfied to build a budget around this faulty assumption?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to commend the member for the actual quote. You have it correct. You heard correctly. We do base our budget on assumptions. We do recognize that, as I said earlier, any budget is a plan. There are you have to monitor closely the revenues and the expenses. What we've done over the last 3 years is to be able to build some capacity within our budget each year for unexpected expenses, and we will certainly continue to make sure that if there is an unexpected expense, that we have capacity to respond to that.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, not only have the workers of the province not agreed to the wage pattern, this issue is now before the court. The economic assumption of this government budget may be found to be unconstitutional, Mr. Speaker. That has been the case in a number of provinces across the country. What is the minister's plan if the courts decide the basis of this budget is illegal?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I know that members opposite like to use the word unconstitutional. However, we do know that we await the rulings of the court. We're fairly confident in the ruling of that, but we will certainly respect that ruling, whatever it may be.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Natural Resources. Last week, my colleague asked the Minister of TIR about a situation in West Chesapeake that has local residents very worried. I'm talking about the berm that separates a freshwater lake from the ocean. The berm was breached in January and again in March. Meetings were held, but nothing has been done to address the breaches. Of course, residents are worried that all the fish in the lake will be killed or washed away, but they also fear that their wells will be contaminated and the basements flooded with seawater. With every stormy weather report, those fears become greater. So my question through you to the Minister, when will the CBCL's consultant report be complete, and when can the people of East Chestercook expect to see some action to address the problems with this berm?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for bringing this question forward. It's something that the Speaker himself has been advocating for very strongly, a great representative of his community.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.